I just wanted to get your immediate reaction to this breaking news that the CEO of Rio Tinto is exiting. Is this a kind of highest level of accountability that we need to see in response to something like this happening?
Thank you. I'm very pleased that the board has asked Jean-Sebastien, Jacques and Simone Niven to leave the company. That will give the company room to now do what is the most important course that they should take, and that is to find the right person to rebuild the internal culture of the company so that the company does not continue to destroy important Aboriginal sacred sites and treat traditional owners, Aboriginal traditional owners and Australians in general with the contempt that Jean-Sebastien, Jacques and Simone Niven have.
So this is an important, a high-profile, a very significant step for corporate Australia, but of course it is, I'd imagine you think, a first step. What more needs to be done now by the new CEO, by the CEOs across and leaders across the mining and business community to be able to repair some of these relationships? And in addition to that, what role does the government, the state government, need to take?
Aboriginal leaders responsible for native title and cultural heritage across Australia have formed a First Nations alliance and have recently met with the Federal Minister responsible for cultural heritage, Minister Susan Lee. We're asking for the Minister to lead an Australia-wide partnership approach to revising the very out-of-date cultural heritage legislation that allows mining companies like Rio Tinto to destroy our cultural heritage on a whim. We know that one of the reasons for Rio Tinto making the decision to destroy caves that had evidence of our occupation, of the occupation of the ancestors of the traditional owners 46,000 years ago, was to be able to meet contractual obligations to provide a particular mix of iron ore exports to China called the Pilbara mix. And the decision to destroy the caves appears to have been made on the basis that the ore beneath those caves was the high-grade ore that they needed for that particular mix. So the cultural heritage legislation across Australia falls far short of our requirements. There are two acts that provide better protection for traditional owners, the Act in the Northern Territory and the Act in Victoria. But improvements can be made, particularly in Western Australia. Yesterday, BHP announced that they'd set up a Cultural Heritage Council with the Bunjima traditional owners in the Pilbara in relation to their mining projects there. So I congratulate BHP for starting to move ahead of the pack and begin proper negotiations with traditional owners on a regular basis to ensure that sites are not destroyed.
Have miners, though, focused too much on negotiating compensation with traditional owners instead of trying to get the consent of the communities there?
The destruction of the Yukon Gorge caves is apparently legal under the terms of both the Cultural Heritage Act in Western Australia and the Indigenous Land Use Agreement negotiated with the traditional owners many years ago, and which is registered with the Federal Court in Australia. But we can see from the evidence of Rio Tinto to the Senate inquiry into this matter, evidence which was in some respects very misleading, and I note that the chairman has called out the company for misleading the Senate inquiry. And so neither the legislation nor the native title agreement protected the cultural heritage. And the company was able to find ways around their legal obligations to go ahead and destroy this precious site.
Given the ongoing issues, then, would it help to have more representation of Indigenous communities in, say, leadership positions or board roles going forward in order to avoid such issues?
The vast majority of Rio Tinto's profits come from the Pilbara. As the Treasurer in Western Australia, or the Deputy Premier, stated recently, Rio Tinto is a Pilbara company, but which knows nothing about the Pilbara. So yes, I believe that Rio Tinto needs an Aboriginal person on its board to represent the interests of Australians. The company has since the appointment of Jean-Sebastien Jacques, treated Australia like a resource colony, based as it is in London, and the board too should take note of the way that Australians feel about how the company has treated the country in which most of its profits are sourced.
Professor Langton, how do you see any kind of responsibility sharing model between governments and corporations? Because in this case, do you attribute much of the blame to lax regulations in the state government that allowed, that approved for this to happen?
The WA Cultural Heritage Act is over 50 years old. It was promulgated in Western Australia in 1972. And Section 18C of that Act is basically an open door for mining companies to obtain government approval for destruction of sites. As far as I know, no minister has ever refused a company permission to destroy an Aboriginal site. So thousands of sites have been destroyed. Moreover, the federal legislation, which the traditional owners ought to have been able to seek remedy from, has been completely ineffective. And neither the minister responsible for that act nor the Indigenous Affairs Minister gave the traditional owners assistance when they approached them to find relief from the impending destruction of the caves. So yes, there is an urgent need for revision of legislation, and that is why the First Nations Alliance is calling for a partnership approach with all the Australian governments involved and the Aboriginal leaders of the native title bodies and the land rights bodies to harmonise the legislation and raise the standards to the accepted international standards for the protection of cultural heritage.
Do you think shareholders, and I include within that funds as well as institutional shareholders, need to put more pressure on corporations like Rio Tinto, like BHP, to really advance progress when it comes to these issues? I am very grateful to those shareholder associations that have put pressure on the company in the last couple of months. The Local Government Pension Fund of Britain, the more recently the Australian Future Fund, and others, Hester, Australian Super, have all written to the company, and some have given evidence to the Senate inquiry, and there is widespread dissatisfaction amongst shareholders about the contempt for cultural heritage that Rio Tinto has expressed, and their resistance to reforming to create a culture of competence. And I call on other shareholders to pay attention to this issue. They are investing in a company that has created a culture of incompetence in relation to the communities in which it operates. The company has treated the Pilbara community with utter contempt. Professor Langton, very quickly before we go, we've seen the Black Lives Matter movement gain momentum this year in the US. How much momentum and vigour has that lent to Indigenous Lives Matters in Australia? And does that go some way to create visibility and draw attention to, as you say, this level of contempt that you see that I think in the past has, at least from the mainstream, gone largely invisible?
the campaign to stop police killings of Aboriginal people started in Australia in the early 1980s following the death of a young man, John Pat, in Western Australia. Aboriginal women formed a campaign and were successful in having a royal commission established to inquire into Aboriginal deaths in custody. The commission considered 99 cases and reported to the Federal Parliament in 1991. It made over 300 recommendations. Most of those recommendations have not been implemented or not fully implemented. Just in the last 48 hours, another Aboriginal woman has died in custody in Brisbane. And a finding by a coronial inquiry in South Australia has found that the death of an Aboriginal man there was completely unnecessary. And once again, the police are likely to not be held accountable for their actions. No police or custodial officer in Australia has ever been held accountable for the death of an Aboriginal person. Now, by my reckoning, we must have about 700 or 800 deaths and still counting since the commencement of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. We know that there are between 400 and 500 Aboriginal deaths in custody that have occurred since 2008.
Right.